Andy Burnham, totally predictably, especially at the beginning of his time, is going to want to be everyone's friend.
Ultimately, not that many people know who Andy Burnham is.
Why not give him the chance to do something different and shake it up a bit? Nobody looks at the way we're governed and thinks, brilliant, this is working really well.
This is essentially how it's gone all week. Great start, we want more.
Everyone's happy for half an hour and then they're like, please can I have some more?
It's been a week of big promises and giveaways, a week of owning the media landscape, a week as Prime Minister.
And today, No.10 North is open for business.
Andy Burnham has been PM for 5 days.
He just needs to stay in power for another 44 to beat Liz Truss's record as the shortest serving Prime Minister. Come on, Andy, you can do it.
Come on, Andy. So today we look at Andy Burnham's first week in office.
I'm Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary.
And I'm Cleo Watson, a former Special Advisor to Theresa May and Boris Johnson. And this is In the Room. Before we get into it, we'd love it if you followed us on Instagram, where you can find all the best bits of the pod. We are at intheroom.pod. You can also watch us on YouTube. Our channel is called In the Room Politics. And if you've got a burning question or you want to send us a lovely bit of fan mail, you can email us. We are intheroom@independent.co.uk. We've been loving the emails so far. Thank you.
Much to the frustration of news desks around the country who generally like to have a little bit more notice, the No.10 press office has been dropping a 6 a.m. press release every day with little policy announcements all week.
So just a very quick explainer on what embargoes are. Normally, to help with newspaper editors, the embargo from a kind of press release says about midnight, 1 minute past midnight, if I recall. And that is so the newspapers the next day will have had time to write up the policy announcement ready to come out in the morning. But what is happening at the moment is emails from No.10 with the announcements are arriving at about 6 a.m. So essentially, the public are getting the news at the exact same time as the radio producers and newspaper editors, which does give the government essentially the morning to have the announcement out in exactly the way they want it to be recorded and talked about. And it's only a bit later that the naughty journalists get to catch up with their particular spin on it and ask questions that could be inconvenient.
So this is an attempt by the Burnham camp very deliberately to be on the front foot, to control their agenda and to be deciding themselves what is going to be the news that day, which has worked most days this week, but not all of them, as we'll come on to. What have we had this week then, Cleo?
Tuesday, which is when we were last recording, we talked about this on the episode, was a VAT cut on electricity bills. Wednesday, Burnham came for the buses, his favourite mode of transport, and he announced a cap on single bus tickets at £2. Side note, I wish he did that for trains. That would make my life much better. On Thursday, pubs, clubs and live music venues in England received a 20% cut to their business rate bills from April. How? He's going to review reliefs provided to antisocial businesses, such as vape shops. And on Friday, Andy's working from home. He's got his first day in No.10 North. Is there a clear run, Helen, so far?
Yes, and I think some of the criticism has been that these are quite small policy announcements for a Prime Minister. I think Kemi Badenoch has described them as mayor level. What a diss. A mayor level announcement. But, the Burnham team have wanted to announce some stuff. They've announced some stuff. There's a couple of things that I think is interesting about them. The first is that it's been a week of Andy Burnham being everywhere, right? So every single story is Andy Burnham does this and Andy Burnham does that. And it's very kind of presidential style. There's not been massive amounts of space. You'd normally get, an announcement which is effectively, the bus fare one is an absolute classic. That is a Department for Transport announcement. Where was Heidi Alexander? Where was all of the kind of media, all of the focus was on Andy Burnham. There are some downsides to operating that way as a Prime Minister. You don't want to really annoy all of your colleagues, and perhaps this would be a time to be spreading a bit of the Andy sunshine around the cabinet, maybe. So I'm not sure how that has gone down. And then some of these announcements, and again, we talked about this on Tuesday, it's been, as always, the government's own side that's been doing some of the knocking on, great, but how are you going to pay for this thing? Which is one of the more frustrating bits of our political discourse these days, is people like, but how are you going to pay for it? It's like, well, we're the government, we're going to work out how to pay for it, is broadly speaking their answer. And I don't know what you thought, but I thought the change the business rates on pubs and make those naughty vape shops pay more rates didn't seem to me like a bit of simple maths that was going to actually deliver the savings that was going to work there. So I'm not really sure how that might work in practice.
I think that's right. The pubs, clubs and live music's announcement wasn't actually that well received from the industry. They all sort of said, this is essentially how it's gone all week. Great start. We want more. Everyone said that. So yeah. Tom Kerridge, who was famously helping him campaign in Makerfield a month ago, was straight out the gate saying, this isn't really going to make any difference.
Welcome to government. Welcome to government. I think this is how it plays out. Everyone's happy for half an hour and then they're like, please can I have some more?
Yeah, exactly. I also thought, he managed to just about squeak John Healey, the new Chancellor, along to his announcement, which he did in a pub for that, mainly because Andy Burnham obviously wanted to pull a pint, because that's the classic prime ministerial shot. He had to pull it for someone. And that was basically all John Healey was there for. And then he sort of beetled away and it all became the Andy show again. I mean, this is absolutely textbook. This is exactly what we did in summer 2019 when we kind of needed to show off to the public that there was a new prime minister and he was listening. It's very Bill Clinton. I feel your pain. I'm in listening mode. And, ultimately, not that many people know who Andy Burnham is, surprisingly. Well, or not, but it might be surprising to him. So he's got to get out there and get known and make a good impression as soon as possible. So this first week of things happening is, I think, just a classic of the genre for trying to give a sense of momentum and change happening. And we've got our sleeves rolled up. Speaking of which, he's got his sleeves rolled up in a very specific place today, has he not, Helen? No.10 North.
No.10 North is opened. And today we're going to have the first meeting of the National Economic Council, which is been announced with great fanfare. And we've got a whole host of ministers all up in No.10 North, changing the country, or so we're told. I think one of the other things to say about the announcements this week, so if you look at the bus fare one, those are exactly the sort of things that everyone says those decisions should be devolved to local level. So you've got, in his first week, Andy Burnham has been making these announcements. They are announcements that in his brave new world of power to the people and local devolution won't belong to national governments anymore. So maybe Andy Burnham, this is the last hurrah of prime ministers in their first week in office, being able to do these very kind of small retail things. We shall see. And yeah, there's been lots of people possibly. There's been lots of people talking about No.10 North. And very obviously, our old stamping ground in Whitehall is extremely cynical about the notion that it's possible to have a centre of power outside of SW1. I have to confess, I'm a big fan of No.10 for the North. Like I've said before, I'm a bit sad that it's in Manchester as opposed to the North, but there we go. But it's a good idea to get ministers and decision makers, people living in totally different place who can actually make decisions which are a bit more tied into the rest of the country and not just in London. It does make a difference. And I sort of think, why not? Why not give him the chance to do something different and shake it up a bit? Nobody looks at the way we're governed and thinks, brilliant, this is working really well. So why not back something which is a big, big shift and a change, an attempt to bring the different kind of DNA, do things differently. I'm an enthusiast.
I'm afraid I think I'm perhaps one of life's pessimists on this one. I think that I can't emphasise enough how much easier it is to run the country when Parliament isn't sitting. And so I think quite a lot of the ministers who do not have seats in Manchester might find the commute quite inconvenient once Parliament is sitting and you have days that you don't have control of. And of course, you are an MP first and foremost, so you need to be back in the constituency doing surgeries and stuff like that. I don't know why, but one of the things that bothers me is just he's just moving everything to Manchester. And I know he's been mayor of Manchester all this time, but a sort of concerned part of me thinks, well, this is great for Manchester, but what about everything else and everywhere else? And you've sort of made this point already. Is it even the North? I don't know if I do love this sort of devolving everything to Manchester instead. It doesn't quite sit right with me. Even like the announcement yesterday on pubs, clubs, live music venues, that directly profits quite a lot of the people who were donors to his campaign in Manchester. And so I think he has to go easy with some of this. We joked on Tuesday that Manchester's our new capital city. I think he has to go easy with some of this. That's separate to actually running the government from somewhere else and running the country properly. I just have a kind of, is the Manchester obsession absolutely correct?
It's interesting you say about MPs and needing to be in their constituencies and how awkward Manchester will be, because this cabinet has got more members of Parliament for the North and particularly the North West than any other in the history of time. There we go. Two exciting facts about this cabinet. It's the most Oxbridge educated that we've had for a very long time. It can't be ever, but it must be in recent years. It's the most Oxbridge educated and the most northern in terms of where they represent their seats. So actually, Manchester's much more convenient than London from them to work from. Who knew?
Well, as a Cardiff University alumni from the Southwest, I don't like it. I don't like it at all.
Don't feel seen. I'm not sure these people are your people, my friend.
I know. I don't feel like I'm being represented. I tell you who has had a good week, and that is Kemi Badenoch.
She has. So she has, I mean, she keeps on getting better and better at doing the kind of basic fundamentals of being good at politics, I would say. She started a speech this week by saying that she thought Andy Burnham was a really nice guy, which is, that's like that's a troubling sign of literacy. So she's been dismissive of him operating at mayoral level in his announcements, which I think, to be fair, I'm sure we've just done a little bit of a sideswipe on that. She's kind of developed this style where she's just happy to do really open Q&A with journalists. And I think it's working remarkably well for her.
I think it works particularly well in the context of most of the lobby being quite cross with No.10 this week. So if she's sort of saying, don't worry, I'll feed the beast and I'll answer any questions you've got, hit me. Whilst the Burnham team are a bit more controlled and, some people are saying they're avoiding scrutiny by doing stuff on TikTok instead. I think that's very interesting. I also just think she's had some good zingers in general on specific things. So Gary Lineker and a bunch of his mates, his millionaire mates, have written a letter saying they should be taxed more. And she's just come back saying, feel free, you're allowed to pay a lot more tax, but you don't need us to, don't need the government to tax you. And I thought that was great. And I noticed No.10 have stayed a bit more quiet about that. I also think she has got a challenge because she's got to work out how to kind of get purchase on Andy Burnham, who is an incumbent, but is coming in as an insurgent. Even the way he's kind of doing his comms just now, like I said, he's doing interviews with TikTok stars and Gary Lineker, and he's doing like his own media rather than using the kind of traditional, let's say, apparatus and system that is there. And I actually thought her final PMQs with Keir Starmer was a bit of a clue for how she'll have to go forward with this. So for those who were watching, I mean, it is quite traditional to be quite nice to the Prime Minister, although Keir Starmer was not very nice to Boris Johnson when he was going out. And she made little jokes, but she was essentially quite generous. And she was not the kind of traditional shouty Kemi Badenoch that she has been for the last couple of years. And I think that is a sign of things to come. A bit like starting that press conference saying, I think he's a nice guy. I don't think it will work for her to look like she's yelling at Andy Burnham in the same way. And so I think, exactly to your point, of her having this kind of summer tour, just like Andy Burnham's doing, of trying to get people to know her better and to see that she's a reasonable and very open person, works really well. There's also something in, depending on how Andy Burnham weathers his spending commitments and how foreign affairs go, because as everyone can see, things are kicking off in the Middle East again. We might end up in this kind of funny dynamic where there'll be a little course correction and the Conservatives will be the kind of centre right again. And they'll be talking about, fiscal responsibility and foreign affairs. And they'll come off as the kind of reassuring grown-ups versus everybody else, and I mean Andy Burnham and Nigel Farage and Zach Polanski and Ed Davey doing skits and stunts and TikToks. Who knows?
Well, and spending commitments. I mean, that's the other thing. I think if that is the divide, is the amount of money that is being casually promised left, right and centre. I mean, I would be interested to see the butcher's bill for this week and how much is actually potentially costing the taxpayer. Because I'm not saying that these are bad policies or that they're bad things to do, but there is a kind of, Andy Burnham's already had to rein back a bit on one of the things he said earlier in the week about adjusting the allowance at which people pay income tax. You can't, if you're the Prime Minister, go around just making soft commitments about spending, because in the end, you're going to have to make some hard choices. We talk about that a lot to governors to choose, and you're adding up quite a lot of spending if this is just week one.
Yeah. I also think as well that if he is putting, a butcher's bill together, as you say, why not include slashing the inheritance tax announcement for farmers that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves brought in and has been incredibly unpopular? He's got to find a voting coalition of people who will vote for him in the next general election. And he is not a rural guy. He's grown up in urban environments. He represents an urban seat. He's very Manchester, and now he'll be quite London. Why wouldn't you have him at like the Royal Welsh Show this week, unveiling a reversal like that, which is the same kind of money we're talking about here? It's not producing a lot of money for the Exchequer, but it builds so much goodwill with a constituency that really don't know him and assume he's more of the same.
You're right about where he's making these decisions and all of this spending. So today we've got the National Economic Council, where with great fanfare, they've talked about how all the mayors are going to be involved, businesses are going to be involved. This is a committee that's going to make big decisions about economic policy. But there is a fundamental problem here in that if you're a mayor of a particular place, your job is to get a really good deal for that place. It's not to get a really good deal for the rest of the country. Very explicitly, no one's going to vote for you as the mayor of South Yorkshire if you've done a really good job for the Welsh farmers. Who cares? That's the point of kind of national government decision making. So there are some really big kind of brewing tensions in between the kind of aspiration of talking about devolution and involving everyone in decision making, and going back to the fact that there has to be choices. And it's not fair or reasonable to ask a load of mayors to decide which of them gets to lose out. That's not going to work. So you have to kind of somehow find a way of balancing and managing this tension. And while Andy Burnham, totally predictably, especially at the beginning of his time, is going to want to be everyone's friend, there is risk in putting it all back on himself. And that's not just for kind of how everybody feels about it. It's also how people feel about it in his own cabinet, because we've seen some interesting plays from our cabinet this week, I think.
Yes, I'm dying to talk to you about that. So you're right. Andy Burnham's had a very sort of presidential style so far as Prime Minister, which is, by the way, interesting. And it's a deliberate tactic we chose again in 2019, that summer. We knew we wanted to have a general election. And we basically worked out the voters we were after, or at least the sort of coalition we could create, weren't really natural Conservatives, but they were willing to vote for Boris Johnson, specifically on Get Brexit Done. And in the same way that one of Kemi Badenoch's problems is that the public seem to like her. She has a very high approval rating, but she's not really able to lift the Conservative vote. So far, Andy Burnham has just been his own thing to me. He doesn't feel like a Labour team player, would you say? And I wouldn't say the rest of his cabinet have been able to catch up with him on his, it's me, Andy. No one's calling them by their first names, apart from maybe Shabana, because she's cool.
Yeah, we've got no Madonnas in the cabinet, it's fair to say. We had John Healey standing up he's got an amazing intonation, John Healey. I don't know if you've noticed this, but when he talks, he really sounds like a vicar. To me, he's got like a very kind of, this reminds me of a story about Jesus kind of vibe. It's amazing. He's a serious grown-up. He's definitely a grown-up. So he gave this speech to the Treasury, and it is your heart sink. When you hear a new minister talk about their priorities, you sort of get your pen out, like, right, let's go. Let's hear these priorities. And then, priority number 3 is backing Britain. Like, I didn't know that was on the table as an option. Were we until now backing any other countries? It's like the king will be delighted to discover that his ministers are on our side. I find the growth in every postcode thing a bit dispiriting.
So those interested in the other 3 priorities for John Healey are fiscal stability, wealth creation, and making life more affordable. And he trotted them out. And I mean, I think it bears repeating that he did this on LinkedIn. a platform I'm not a member of. And it was backed to some of the worst music I've ever heard. The whole thing was just like, it was just really lame. And it has, not everyone will get this reference, but the film Mean Girls, where the mother in that says, I'm not a regular mom, I'm a cool mom. And there's been a lot of that from the cabinet this week, where they've just sensed the change with Andy Burnham, and now they've completely changed their personalities to be kind of high-fiving and hugging and all this.
Can we just pause a bit on the hugging? Because one of the things I found very difficult to watch is the amount of hugging. The awkward hugging this week has been off the charts. If that was something that we could bank as a productivity or prosperity, we'd be winning this week. It's been horrendous.
It's also a specific hug because it's combined with doing up the button of a suit jacket. So then you get this kind of scrunch up someone's got to go high and someone's got to go low on a hug, right? That's just physics. Someone gets their jacket all bunched up trying to go high, and it's so unnatural. They're trying not to touch crotches. I hate it. I mean, just shake hands.
Of crotches. Shake hands. The handshake. What has happened to the handshake? I really. Some of the I'm sure that our lovely team will find some clips of this so that you can enjoy it to your heart's content. But there are some horrendous kind of awkward handshake into grabbing elbows into hug. I think the new Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister win the absolute prize for that. And that troubles me because 85% of Ed Miliband's job as Foreign Secretary is being able to execute a competent handshake with anyone, really. And this is someone he's supposed to know really well, and he can't even manage the handshake, smile to camera, camaraderie pat on the back.
There's also an incredibly awkward photo of Ed Miliband and Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, meeting. And they look like they're at their wedding or something. They're just like, it's side on, it's side profile, and they're just gazing into each other's eyes. And you think, do you, Ed, take Marco? And again, obviously, that's actually been choreographed, which is weird. That's not even like, in the 3-second awkward moment, this is how Ed Miliband, hugs people. That was also, decided by their mutual teams. Oh yeah, we should put this picture out. It's absolutely bizarre. I would say also the pictures of Wes Streeting standing next to all the sort of, dare I say, beefy defence dudes are a bit awkward as well. And they remind me a little of when Gavin Williamson, who people may recall had been chief whip and then became defence secretary. He looked similarly, I think you've got to be able to puff your chest out perhaps. And they both look a little bit, gosh, this is very bitchy, but here we go, a bit Private Pike from Dad's Army.
I think that's totally fair. It's factually accurate, Cleo. On the hugging, there was Jonathan Reynolds when he arrived back at the business department. I think there was, again, probably a video I saw on LinkedIn, for which apologies. But he just hugged everybody. And I'm not somebody who doesn't believe in affection. Lovely, gorgeous. Actually, a bit of a hugger at work myself occasionally.
I mean, you spent a lot of your time telling people to stop doing it where it was appropriate to touch someone.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that has been thrown into disarray this week.
It's very confusing. Dare I say it's the influence of football into political life. One of the things I do want to talk to you about is we've had this series of policy announcements that has been very much under the government's control. But there was a story this week which they had to respond to. And I think it was interesting to see how they responded. And that was, of course, the prisoner release story. To just give a kind of quick potted history of what's going on here. The Starmer government had this plan to tackle overcrowding in prisons with the early release of some prisoners, which is, I'm afraid to say, quite standard. It's happened in many governments beforehand. But this was a shocker in particular because it involved two of the killers of PC Andrew Harper, who people might remember was the young policeman who was killed in the line of duty while responding to a theft in 2019. So it is a kind of cocktail of all the ingredients that a new government doesn't want to deal with, which is kind of soft on crime plus a visceral story that everybody remembers. PC Harper had a widow who was in the public eye for quite a long time, campaigning for sentencing against, for crimes against police officers and stuff. So it's been pretty awful, actually. And how do these things go, Helen?
No, so you're right. This is the first kind of big external event story that the new government had to respond to. And we have not been building enough prisons or keeping enough prison places for a very, very long time. It is very difficult for secretaries of state for justice to win the argument within government that on the long, long list of things that people like spending money on, would you like to spend the money on a new prison? No, thanks. I'd much rather spend the money on something which people are going to see and like and is a positive thing. So the net consequence of this is that we've been keeping our prison population at a level which is totally unsustainable. And this was a problem when Keir Starmer came in 2024. He made all sorts of kind of quite tough decisions, including that some prisoners, in order to keep the prison population safe, some prisoners needed to be released early. There was an awful lot of work done, a debate, discussion, etc., etc. That is now starting. So inevitably, as night follows day, then people are told, rightly, that the person who has committed the crime against their loved one is going to be early released because that's an important piece of transparency. And again, as night follows day, those stories are awful. And just from a kind of common sense perspective, you look at that and think, hang on a second, surely this can't be the only way. What is slightly kind of small bell ringing for the Burnham prime ministership is this has all been considered really recently by a Labour government. This isn't a kind of inherited from Conservatives policy. This is a fresh policy of this government that's been pretty much thought through. There aren't easy answers to prison places. And yet the first thing that they did was say, well, Burnham has stopped this, put a stop to it, and there's going to be a review. That review is not going to find magic answers, which have not been considered up until now, I would say, although there's one thing that you and I do think is a magic answer, which we should talk about in a second. But it's kind of the leaning into, not this is a terrible problem and these are the consequences, but I'm quickly going to review everything that there's any criticism of. I mean, probably had to do that this week because it is the first week, but there's a really, is this the way that you are going to do these things? Because you're just delaying the point at which you're inevitably going to have to say, well, actually, we do have to release people.
Didn't you think it was an interesting lack of distance, though, to have the Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, is looking into this, not the Justice Secretary?
Yes. And that goes to our kind of presidential style that you would, if you're fully inhabiting your Prime Minister role, you are shocked to discover this is happening and you say, you boy, you go or you girl, you look into this and tell me what on earth is going on and come back to me with some options. Yeah, it would have been smarter to just say, Justice Secretary, come back to me by next Friday with a plan for how you're going to stop this from happening.
Well, you made this point a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Shabana Mahmood and how clever she's been with politics, because people's memories of the sentence of, say, Lucy Connolly, who spent 13 months in prison for a tweet. Keir Starmer was characterised as two-tier Keir after that. Whereas people forget that Shabana Mahmood was Justice Secretary at all during that period.
Indeed. So you spotted that Edward Garnier, who's a former Conservative minister in the Lords, had made a very sensible suggestion about what might be done a couple of weeks ago.
Yes. Can I just throw a few stats in to contextualise this? So in my lifetime, which I don't entirely care to admit to, but it's, let's say, late 80s to now, the prison population has risen by 94%. So it's nearly 90,000 people at the moment, which is a lot of people. And exactly as you said, Helen, we've not been building the prisons to house them. So Edward Garnier's had this great idea, I think, where in England and Wales, we've got 3,650 women in prisons, and they're all kept in women's prisons. There are 12 of them in England. Of that 3,650, only 2,500 of them are in custody for non-violent offences. So that's about 70% of the women's prison population. And that is honestly for stuff like unpaid gas bills. So, or indeed a tweet. So there is a real question about why doesn't the government look at the non-violent women prisoners and do a bit of reorganising and then use some of these prisoners to house the worst of the worst from the men's prisons. And the interesting thing about this is Harriet Harman, the former interim Labour leader, has actually endorsed this position presumably because you can actually strike two birds with one stone here, which is from the kind of good politics side, which is tough on crime and proper sentencing, and also carry some of the kind of women's sensitivities here and say it's just completely ridiculous to be banging up women who have families and so on for crimes that in the eyes of many of the public, they don't really think are crimes. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. We used to imprison people for not paying the license fee.
Yeah, and I think the damage that's done, one of the problems with putting people in prison is the damage that's done to the family and to the children and to the community and to everything else. So there are very, very good arguments that it's not a good idea to put people in prison if you can at all avoid it. Who have, and that's men with children as well as women with children. But it's particularly odd that this very obvious solution has not in fact been looked at up until now.
There's something else as well, which I think already is slightly embroiling Andy Burnham, because he sort of threw his weight behind the idea of deporting the leader of the Rotherham grooming gangs when he was released from prison a couple of weeks ago. And he did a tweet basically saying, we've got to do something about this. We can't have people like this in the country. And the eagle-eyed on Twitter have noticed that, you know, of the prison population, about 12% of them, so that's about 10,000 prisoners, are foreign nationals. And so I wonder whether in part of this review, you know, there are what you could call more positive solutions, endorsed by Harriet Harman, which will make a lot of the Labour women MPs feel more secure, which is creating space in women's prisons, but also a greater clamouring for deporting foreign nationals who the taxpayer is paying for to sit very comfortably in HMPs at the moment.
Well, I mean, it's questioned very comfortably. And I also think that one of the problems when you get down that route is that you're letting people evade justice because you are they've committed a crime in our country, which is why they're in prison in our country. And yes, you can deport them, but are you deporting them into a prison in another country? It's actually, again, it's quite complicated to work out exactly what do you do, which is why go back to this was a problem when it was a problem in the last year of Rishi Sunak's government. It was a problem in the first couple of years of Keir Starmer's government. There's quite a lot of complexity in it. I personally think the women prisoner thing is probably the most useful thing to do. But for our purposes, it tells us that Andy Burnham is taking problems onto himself that he might not need to be taking onto himself. And that
exactly.
his reflex to review and look shocked and ask questions it can't be a mode that he stays in for very long, because in the end, you want government to look strong and you don't want him to disown and distance himself from every single thing that the previous government has done. I know that this team think that they're totally shiny and new and that they're going to be really different and look at all the stuff that they are, but the government that was elected is the same people in parliament, and you can't totally distance yourself from the previous 2 years, because we've seen parties try to do that in the past and that doesn't work either.
Yes. And actually, I think adding to that, the idea of new directors of communications coming in and saying, I'm going to do this differently. I mean, it's a story as old as time. And we came up against this a bit in number 10 when we were there. So, one of the interesting takes this week has been that Andy Burnham is not facing scrutiny properly because he's not doing a lot of the sort of traditional BBC interviews and so forth. And we came under a lot of fire in the 2019 general election because Boris Johnson didn't do the Andrew Neil, the classic Andrew Neil sits down with the party leaders interview. And there was a huge amount of pressure internally from people saying, you must do this. Lots of Tory grandees, you must do this, you must do this. And he didn't do it because he got hammered. And guess what? The public didn't care at all. And there's a bit of that going on here.
Look, I mean, there were lots of kind of, would have, should have, is this going to last, all of those things. I think it's fair to say that as week one goes, been pretty good. Pretty good.
It has.
Pretty good for Andy. I would say that, it's school report time of the year, and I would say he's either at greater depth or exceeded expectations or whatever. I think it's been not a bad week. They'll be pleased with themselves when they get to the weekend, and then they won't think about it properly, but they've got to start it all again next week. I mean, that's the other thing, that this new team, and it is a really quite new team in both number 10 in London and number 10 in the North, are going to have to, they've got a long old summer ahead of them, I think, as they are trying to learn their way around these various buildings and work out who does what and how they work together. And if the 6 a.m. new notices of policy can't last the summer, surely we're not going to be living in that forever. It would be a very funny way to run a country. But, watch this space, I guess.
Yes. Well, there we go. A glowing endorsement from one Cambridge alum to another.
We stick together as Northern Cambridge alum. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Remember to follow the show on your podcast player of choice and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed it.
And do please email us your feedback and questions. We are intheroom@independent.co.uk. And if you're listening on Spotify, you can also comment on today's episode with your thoughts. And you can keep up to date with the best bits of the pod on Instagram. We are @intheroom.pod.
This podcast is part of the Independent Podcast Network and produced in association with Next Chapter Studios.
The executive producer is Ardehali and the producer is Sam Durham.
And a special mention to our content editor, Myra Nishka, and our video editor, Vali Raza.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, unless you're attending Latitude Festival, in which case we'll see you on Sunday.